Hi, my name is Dr. Carlos Sabillon, and I've been doing research on economic growth for the last 20 years after I finished my doctorate degree at the University of Geneva, Switzerland. And right now the world is going through a big problem. Western Europe in general is having a big problem with its public debt. It can't pay it, and the United States has a similar problem. It has its huge deficit, a huge budget deficit, a huge public sector debt it can't pay. And everybody's very concerned about what's going to happen. Is the world going to fall into a second recession, into a second world depression as it did in 2008, 2009? And that is the thing. I've developed a new doctrine about how to solve economic problems anywhere in the world, not just for Europe and the U.S., but also for Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, which is such a big turmoil, and obviously the region where I come from, which is Latin America. We have been working very hard without pay the last 20 years in order to do this research because the economic science has never figured out what causes economic growth. As a result of it, like 80% of the world population lives in poverty, and the other 20% that does not live in poverty has to endure regularly high levels of unemployment and underemployment because the rate of economic growth is too slow. And that is the basic problem with Europe and the U.S. Present problems, that they can't pay their debt. Their rate of economic growth in the last, not just years, not just since 2008 to the present, but also since like the 1970s has been too slow. And I want to show you some statistics so that you can better grasp the idea. And as you can see, this is Western Europe. This is just the countries that were not under central planning, under communist rule during the Soviet Union period. And as you can see, the rate of economic growth has been decelerating significantly. Has been going down and down and down, and this situation has presented not just the problem of a big increase in unemployment and underemployment, but also a lack of flow of money into government coffers. That means the government is receiving a lot less money because the slower the rate of economic growth, the more frequent will companies go bankrupt, or they will have losses which will drive them not to bankruptcy, but they will have to cut their payroll. They will have to fire a certain amount of workers. Sometimes it's small companies, medium or large one. It doesn't matter. As a whole, it affects them equally. So it's not a lack of morals that European or American businessmen are exporting the jobs to China or India or wherever. It's basically that the policies, the economic policies in Western Europe and the U.S. have been bad in the last 30, 40 years, and therefore the rate of economic growth has been much slower. As a result, that the rate has been systemically going down. Nations like those of Western Europe and the U.S. need a bare minimum of 3% so that unemployment will not increase. If they have at a certain moment, like right now, they have a high level of unemployment and they want to reduce it, then they gotta attain a faster rate of growth. And as you can see, the vast majority of countries in Western Europe, and that includes the countries that are having big problems right now, like, for example, Greece, Spain, Portugal. These countries in the 1950s and the 1960s had a growth of 7, 8% annually. That means over a 20-year period, they grew by about 7% per year. And right now, they're barely growing by 1% annually. So there is a big difference, and the question is why? Why has that changed so radically? Well, it's a matter of bad policies, because somebody can argue that perhaps us Latin Americans do not have the cultural merits or whatever to attain fast economic growth. But the fact is that we're comparing here Western Europe against Western Europe, or the U.S. against the U.S., and in past decades they attained much faster rates of growth. So the issue is how can Western Europe and North America get those rates of growth back to the rates attained in the 1950s and the 1960s? That's not just a cultural thing. Somebody says it's Western culture. No, Japan has suffered the same situation. I want to show you some statistics about Japan and see. As you can see, the rates of Japan, which has a completely different culture, that of Western nations like those in Europe, and particularly Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, they have been also going down, steadily down, to the point of they're barely growing. In the last decade, they barely had a growth. In the first decade of the 21st century, they barely had a growth of 1%. So this is comparable to that of Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe, which also grew by 1% in the first decade of the 21st century. So that is extremely bad when we think that Japan in the 1960s was growing at 11% annually, and Germany in the 1950s grew at 8% annually. Big gap. Somebody says because of the war. That's not the case. Sweden and Switzerland did not suffer any destruction of the war. There was nothing to reconstruct. That has been the traditional argument. And they grew by 6% annually in the 1950s and the 1960s. So there is no excuse for growing. It is something else. And what we know for sure is that the economic science is very different from other science. The science has never figured out what causes economic growth. It is not like medicine, where they have still not figured out, for example, a vaccine against cancer or a final cure against all forms of cancer. But they have made impressive achievement, and that's why we have nowadays, at least in most developed nations, a life expectancy of 80 years on average. That's what pretty much everybody gets to live in a nation like Germany or even Spain. And while 1,000 years ago, life expectancy was just of 17 years in those same nations. So there's been a big difference, and in part because sciences like the medical science have made big improvements. In economics, there has been practically no improvement on the fundamental matter, which is economic growth. So I've been working very intensively, and I've abstained from earnings over the last 20 years since I finished my PhD in Europe. And in Switzerland, and I did also a postdoctorate in Switzerland and a postdoctorate in Germany at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. And I found a correlation which is very important with respect to growth. And I look at the economic history of all nations of the world, or the most important ones. From all cultures, Japan, Russia, Germany, Britain, the U.S., Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Iran, India. I looked at pretty much all cultures, and I found a consistent correlation which explained like 80% of the rate of economic growth. That is, when smarter people more educated people would attain power, would become kings or would become presidents or prime ministers or heads of state. Doesn't matter. The fundamental person, which is ultimately the one who decides economic policy, macroeconomic policy, rates of growth accelerated. There is a correlation between intelligence and economic growth. And we know from history, Europe has a terrible history when it comes to letting ignorant people get to power, just letting anybody. That's a basic principle of democracy, but it is not a good principle. It is a principle that has led to, for example, Adolf Hitler, who gained power in completely legal way in November 1932. He was in the opposition. You can't even say that he used government funds to finance a big political campaign. No, he did it out of his impressive oratory, which is something that has never accelerated the rate of economic growth. There is no correlation between great public speaking abilities, which is the biggest asset in a politician as democracy is structured right now, and fast economic growth. We know that when nations, Western Europe in particular, because of what it suffered during the 50 million deaths, the 6 million youths that were assassinated in gas chambers, Western Europe came out traumatized from this situation, came out with the idea that the worst thing that can happen to a nation is to tolerate racism. Racism is not good because it has no scientific basis, but that was not what led Hitler to power. It was two things that allowed Hitler to power. One, the structure of the democratic system that allows anybody to get to power, even if it's a high school dropout like Hitler, who never finished high school, dropped out of 15 years, who was a schizophrenic, and was full of crazy ideas about anti-Semitism and the evil of Jews. So this is the big problem with letting everybody. It's not just they attain very slow rates of economic growth, but every so and then we have extremely crazy people like Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot in Cambodia, who didn't get to power through democracy, but who was a person who only had an elementary degree and who also had mental health problems. And that's why he even killed 1/3 of his own people in Cambodia. So we know we just can't allow anybody into power. This idea is not a good one. And this is what caused so much of what has determined the structure of Europe nowadays, this whole effort of integrating, which is worthwhile, but in itself can't be the goal in itself, has become the goal in itself because of what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s during Nazi rule. And what happened was a result of insufficient rates of economic growth. We know that in 1929, in October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, and it led to a complete collapse of the economy of the U.S. and of Europe. Germany was even worse hit than the U.S. The economy contracted in 1930, 31, and 32 by less than 10%, -10, -10, -11 in those 3 years. That created an unemployment of more than 30% in Germany. By November 1932, about 1 million Germans have died of hunger and exposure because of the economic collapse. And this extreme situation, because traditional political parties couldn't generate fast economic growth, drove people to get desperate and vote for the Nazis. So, we got two problems here. Insufficient rate of economic growth, we find it constantly leading to poverty and unemployment worldwide, and coinciding with terrible things: wars, civil wars, extremely high levels of crime, and racism, anti-Semitism. We've seen this stuff over and over and over and over again. We've seen it in sub-Saharan Africa. people getting within the same country, killing each other massively, like the Hutus and Tutsis in 1994 in Rwanda. These are people that barely have any ethnic differences, but just tiny, small difference in an atmosphere of extreme poverty, in an atmosphere where rates of economic growth have never been fast, will drive people to kill each other in a mass murderous way that are reminiscent to what the Nazis did in the 1930s and 40s. So, the fundamental thing in order to eliminate racism and anti-Semitism and also forms of violence is to accelerate that rate of economic growth. And existing economic policy from the right, the left, or the center can't guarantee that. So I have found a correlation. I analyzed the economic history of all nations throughout the world over the last 2,000 years, 2,500 years more or less, since the birth of democracy in ancient Greece, in ancient Athens. And I found a correlation between intelligence, between the overall level of brain capacities of the rulers of a nation, and the rate of economic growth. So there is a need to improve the democratic system, to reform it, to restructure, in order to attain faster rates of economic growth, which will guarantee all nations of the world. There are more than 200 economies throughout the world that will guarantee all of these nations fast and sustained economic growth. And in order to do that, we need to restructure the democratic system. We need to obviously get out of all these monarchical systems from the Middle East, as well as other dictatorships. In Europe, there's still Belarusia that is still having a dictator. We need to get rid of all these people. We know that all this doesn't work, doesn't correlate with fast economic growth over the long term. We've seen monarchies all over the world and systemically had miserable rates of economic growth over centuries. Democracy has attained faster rates of economic growth than the monarchical system or any other system that we've seen. However, the rates are still insufficient. We're lingering here in Latin America over the last 3 decades with a rate of 3% annually. That is totally insufficient. These nations need a bare minimum of 8% because they got higher rates of unemployment than North America, Western Europe, and much higher rates of poverty. And developed countries need just like about 4%. But if France, Germany, Britain, Spain, Portugal, Greece, the U.S., Canada, all these nations could attain again rates of 8%. The U.S. attained rates of 8% annually over a 20-year period, the last 20 years of the 19th century. Canada also had impressive rates of growth in those years. If they could attain those rates, because we know from their history that it is not impossible, then it would be even a lot better than 4%. It would be a lot better than 4%. And we know that it wouldn't cause any problems, like, for example, higher rates of inflation. We know it as a fact that there is no correlation between rates of economic growth and inflation. We've seen, for example, Singapore, which is now standing by 2010, income per capita in Singapore was much higher than in the U.S. But right now we'll make a pause and then we'll get back to you with more specifics on this subject about how can all nations attain impressive economic growth with very low rates of inflation, simultaneously improve their income distribution, promote a better distribution of income, and get rid of all the violence that in some countries is just stratospheric. In others is very low, but even in nations such as most of Western Europe, they would rather eliminate it completely. So we'll be back in a second. We're talking about this trend all over developed countries of decelerating rates of economic growth over the long term. We had seen we've shown the rate of growth of the average of all Western European nations. We show a rate of what you saw, a G, a D, and a P, which is gross domestic product, which is the rate of economic growth. Gross domestic product is the overall economy of a nation, everything that goes around there: trade, tourism, services, industry, manufacturing, construction, mining, everything. And they put it all together and see how much does it increase or decrease. Decreases every year. So there is this situation which presents itself, and we've seen this decelerating rates of growth over the long term in Western Europe in practically every single nation, with exception in the 1990s of Ireland. There in Ireland we saw a big jump in the rate of economic growth from a rate of just 3% in the 1980s to a rate of 8% annually. That is average annual rates of growth. So here, once again, there is clear evidence that the nations of, at least of Western Europe, are not condemned to decelerating rates of growth, because there's so many excuses. One of it is that this situation after the Second World War, which was, there was all this destruction and needed to be reconstructed. Once again, Sweden and Switzerland didn't suffer any destruction because they were neutral, and the Nazis and the Allies respected, and there was no bombing or destruction or foreign troops in their soil, and yet they grew at a rate of about 6% annually in those 1950 to 1969. That rate, and can now see another nation, a nation that is still has the largest economy in the world, the United States, and as we can see over the last 60 years, its rates of growth have been almost systemically decelerating, and in the last decade, the first decade of the 21st century, rates of growth were the worst of all. Only in the 1930s, the chaotic and terrific 1930s, the decade of the Depression, was the rate of economic growth in the United States slower than the one in the 21st century. Look, the rates of growth, the further we go back in time, they become more murky, harder to figure out these rates of growth. But from the economic historical evidence that the best experts in American history show, it suggests that the rate of growth that the U.S. attained in the in the first decade of the 21st century was the second worst decade in the last 200 years. So that's pretty bad. That's very bad, and it shows something about what's there has to be something that's going on wrong, and there is, as you see, these decelerating rates of growth. Many have suggested that in the parties of conservative parties of the right, Republicans in the U.S., Christian Democrats in Germany, conservatives in Britain, the PP in Spain, and so conservative parties which have through history attained faster rates of economic growth than leftist parties, whether center-left or extreme left, still they tend to argue that there has been a continuous increase in spending in environmental matters over the last 60 years, and that expenditures, although needed to maintain ecological balance, is hurting rates of economic growth, and there's an exchange of good things. You get more jobs, but you damage more the environment. Now, we're going to show you now the statistics of China. And the case of China invalidates that argument. Look at these figures. Here we go. Okay, here we got the figures from China. And as you can see, rates of growth in the last 30 years since the 1980s have been pretty spectacular, and that's why in In 2010, China became the second largest economy in the world, displacing Japan. But interesting is the first decade of the 21st century. Look at it. It's an impressive 9% annual growth. And because of that rate of growth, China has attained impressive things. It is in 2009, it became the largest market in the world for automobiles. It had, for 5 years before, become the largest market in the world for steel. Since like 2002, it became the largest market in the world for cell phones. In 2009, it became the largest exporter in the world, displacing Germany, which had maintained that first position for numerous years. So all of this because of the fast rate of economic growth, which has been propelling fast rates of exports also. Now, the interesting thing with China is that China made a huge effort in the first decade of the 21st century to combat environmental damage and especially global warming, climate change. So it invested massively in wind generating energy generated by wind turbines and energy generated by photovoltaic cells, by solar cells. And by 2010, China was not just spending more in overall, measured in dollars or in euros, it was spending more than the United States of America, which in 2010 was still a much larger economy. It was spending more on wind turbines and photovoltaic cells. Wind and solar energy, it was spending more than the United States. Now, as a share of GDP, China was spending a lot more, not just in the U.S. The U.S. was spending 0.7% of its total economy, of its total GDP, while China was spending 1.4, double the amount. So what this shows is the following. China surpassed a lot of developed nations which have been or the only ones or almost the only ones investing in these new technologies that are the one who promise most to free the world from these huge emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbon that are changing the world climate, increasing the world temperature, and making the world climate go crazy. More droughts, more floods, more hurricanes, more tornadoes, more huge snows. The thing is that we've seen a China that invalidated two ideas. The idea is that if you invest a lot in environmental matters, that you invest a lot in fighting global warming, you will have a decelerated rate of economic growth and unemployment will grow up. China proved that thesis, that idea, that premise was false. Okay? In a sustained basis. This was not a one-year fluke, a one-year situation which you could say, oh, that does not demonstrate a trend. This was a 10-year period. Okay, there was at the beginning of the 21st century, China, the Politburo, the 9 persons that ruled China, in which you find the president and the premier, decided that they were going to shift policy. Instead of trying to generate the bulk of their energy from coal and oil, they're going to shift it massively towards, not just towards natural gas, which is less contaminating, less damaging, but in a new direction towards solar energy and wind energy. And they have succeeded in generating a significant share, and they're moving at a breathtaking speed. And what this shows us is that there is no contradiction in between accelerating the rate of economic growth and attaining fast economic growth and fighting global warming, fighting overall environmental damage. We see this situation. Now, this once again shows us another situation. I want to show you, to reinforce this idea, this other statistic. As you can see, this is GDP per capita on purchasing power parity terms. These are statistics from the CIA fact book, which is considered one of the best sources of economic statistics in the world. I know the CIA has a bad reputation, but the statistics show clearly that Singapore is the richest of those countries we show there. And Singapore is, on average, in 2010, each inhabitant of Singapore, on average, was able to consume that huge amount, $62,000, while the Americans was only 47, and most European nations were even lower, as well as Japan. So, as you can see, I put there Honduras also, because Honduras is my home country, and I'm making this documentary, this small speech from Tegucigalpa in Honduras. So, the thing is the following. We have here a situation where the case of Singapore has been, before the subject of climate change became a big thing worldwide, Singapore began very environmental, very ecological, because it has to. Singapore had, in 2010, like for example, the United States had about 30 persons per square kilometer. Germany had 250. It's a lot more densely populated. Singapore has 7,000 persons per square kilometer. They have to be very ecological, because otherwise they would asphyxiate with all those fumes from combustion engine automobiles and pollution from the factory's traditional way. So they have been very strict on this matter. And you go to Singapore and levels of pollution are low by overall international standards and even by developed country standards. So Singapore has been fighting against environmental damage and global warming in a very committed way over the last decade. And that hasn't hindered Singapore from attaining a much faster rate of economic growth, which is the reason why in 2010, well, we're speaking from 2011, but this is the last figure we got, why in 2010 it was much wealthier than practically all nations in Western Europe, all nations in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. So we see there is no contradiction. Whether it is a developing country like China, which is still a third world country, a nation can invest massively in fighting global warming and other environmental forms of degradation, and at the same time attain fast economic growth. The case of Singapore shows that developed countries, it applies also for developed countries, they can fight environmental damage and global warming decisively, committedly, not just puny amounts of money, and simultaneously get rates of economic growth which are dazzling, not fast, dazzling. Here, we gotta show you a new set of statistics. This is just the year 2010. As you can see, the nations we show there did not attain great rates of economic growth in the year after the big recession. After the big depression of 2009, we didn't. Singapore, they haven't recovered. As we saw, the United States only got 3%. The United States saw a negative 3% in 2009. So getting 3% the next year was just, on average for the 2 years, zero. Had it gotten 0 and 0 in both years, everybody would have said it was catastrophic. And the fact is that at the end of 2010, unemployment rate in the United States was at 9%, very high, very high. In 2007, which was not a good year, they have had that rate. of unemployment at 5%. So, and it was not a good situation. It was hard finding a job in the U.S., especially a good job. Still, we see a situation in which Singapore attained 15% rate of economic growth. And we saw the nations, Germany, which had the best rate of growth in Europe, at least among the big nations, had 4. And in 2011, we're hearing already by mid-2011 that things are going down. Okay, that the second quarter of 2011 we saw a deceleration in practically all West European nations, not just the laggards of Greece, of Portugal, of Spain, of Italy. No, the other ones too. And in the U.S., the same situation. So, the Western world, Japan is already in recession. They'll say because of the tsunami. Japan was hit in other decades, like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, by earthquakes and tsunamis. And they didn't bring down the fast rate of economic growth. It doesn't have to do with natural catastrophes or with the great crisis of 2008, 2009. By the way, what caused that great financial crisis? It was the neoliberal idea that said, let the banks do whatever they want. They can play like a casino and speculate like crazy and drive whole nations, the whole world into bankruptcy. So these theories of the right and the left have failed. Look, we've seen these decelerating rates of economic growth all over the world. We see what? Everywhere. Japan, Australia, Western Europe, the U.S., Canada. What do we see in all these nations? We've seen over the last 6 decades an increase in both policies of the left and of the right. We have seen a systemic increase in the size of welfare expenditures as a share of GDP, and the rate of economic growth has gone down. We've seen also an increase in rightist policies that say you got to invest more and you got to let the market run loose, especially banks. That was the worst of all decisions. But even when they're not letting companies go crazy, banks go crazy, they still got miserable. They were still getting decelerating rates of economic growth because the market is not the best for deciding. Science is. And that's the core of our new vision of the world, our new economic doctrine, which puts the basis on the intelligence of the leaders of the nation, especially the prime minister or president or head of state or whatever. This is the key to getting fast economic growth, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're going to make a small pause, and then we're going to get back to you to explain more in detail these situations. So wait a second, we will be back in a minute. Originally, we were talking about situations such as, is it possible to grow rapidly with very low rates of inflation? Because this is a general idea which is false. There is no data that supports that claim, which claims that nations cannot grow too fast, otherwise the rate of inflation go up. And if they go up, those rates of inflation will eventually bring down the fast rate of economic growth. And they will also shift income. They will make a minority wealthier at the expense of others. So we look at the economic history of nations, and there is no correlation. For example, Germany in the 1950s, in that decade, attained a rate of economic growth of 8%, with a rate of inflation of just 2% annually. So it is possible to have both things. Somebody says again, oh, well, it was an exceptional situation because of the aftermath of the Second World War. What about the U.S. in the last 20 years of the 19th century? Actually, it's a bigger period, but I want to grab that period because it had the faster rates of economic growth in the U.S. history. It was an 8% annual growth. It was very, very fast, and the rate of inflation was zero annually, zero rate of inflation. They didn't even have a central bank back then, which is supposed to be the guardian of controlling inflation. That's the concept of having an independent European central bank of the Fed in the U.S., which came into being until 1914. Back then it didn't exist. So we can see, but even more long term, Singapore, from 1960 to 2010, it had an average rate of economic growth of about 8% annually. It was very, very fast, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but on average more or less 8%. And the rate of inflation was just 2% annually, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower. But it was maintained. Normally it is considered by orthodox economists that the ideal rate of inflation is between 0 and 3%. So here we have an ideal rate of inflation with impressive rates of economic growth over half a century. It can be attained. Now, how do you do that? And this is the core of the principle of the new political system that I've been researching on that would accelerate the rate of economic growth. Through history, for the last 2,500 years, all over the world, there has been a correlation that explains about 80% of the growth of all nations. It would accelerate or decelerate depending on the level of intelligence. The intelligence of a ruler is a mixture of numerous things. It is its overall level of education and the intelligence that it was born, that this person was born with. New studies in genetics show us that about 75% of the intelligent human being is genetic. You're born with it. But obviously somebody who doesn't study will get to nothing, because when you reason without the data, without the statistics, without the historical precedent, it's like speculating in void. It's useless. So you need a person that has accumulated a huge amount of studies and a huge amount of, and better still, that it was born with a high intelligence. As a ruler, as a prime minister, as a president, as a head of state, that's what nations need. And to show the case, we look at the nations that were the first to start adopting a mechanism that increased the level of intelligence. Democracy increased the level of intelligence of the rulers, because obviously started putting what? Usually lawyers, which were on average a lot more intelligent than the average monarch, than the average king of past centuries. And immediately we saw faster rates of economic growth, for example, in the 17th century, in the second half of the 17th century, in Britain and in the Netherlands, which created the first parliamentary democracies in the world. In the U.S., starting with the first government, the democratic government in 1789, with George Washington, we also witnessed a big acceleration in the rate of economic growth, which has been, in broad general terms, sustained throughout the whole democratic period, much faster than in the 17th and 18th century during monarchical rule. So we also see that the region of the world that has been governed by the least educated people is sub-Saharan Africa, and it has, by 2010, by 2011, still the lowest levels of development, the highest levels of poverty. So through history, China, which we mentioned, which has had extremely was until 1912, until 1911, China was ruled by kings, by emperors, and there was no progress. And then we saw some progress with people who were a little bit more intelligent. First, governments, conservative government, and then communist government. But then in 1979, China decided to copy pretty much the model of Hong Kong and Singapore, which is a model that puts emphasis on a technocracy, on a professionalization of not just the civil service, but even the person at the top. In Hong Kong, there is no democracy. In Singapore, there has been since 1959, since Britain gave independence. And we have seen democracies that are elections that are a lot more clear than the ones in Africa, in Latin America, or in South Asia, or even in Eastern Europe since the collapse of communism. We've seen a lot better, and still we see a situation in which in which we're able to attain. Singapore has not had. Many criticize Singapore for not having a real democracy, but it has been a lot more cleaner than all these third world and middle income countries of all these regions we've mentioned about. Not talk the Middle East, that until now, until 2011, they didn't even have a democracy, not a single one, just Israel. So we see in Singapore, it is a principle that ignorant people cannot get the top jobs, period. And what is so wrong about that? And the issue is that when we don't have fast economic growth, we see atrocious, terrible things like the one we saw in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. Crazy people get to power. The one in Rwanda in 1994. Okay, 800,000 people killed among a population that was just of about 7 million. That was huge. Or in Cambodia. So we need the smartest people in the world. It's a principle that applies in everything. The richest people in the world, when they get sick, everybody, whether poor or rich, when they get sick, they search for a medical doctor. They don't go to an engineer, to a lawyer, to an architect, to a businessman, no matter how successful this businessman, No, they go to a medical doctor. And if they're sure that their problem is a heart problem, they'll look for a cardiologist. Jesus Christ, the same thing. You have problems with your teeth, simple things like a cavity. You don't search a medical doctor, even if he's the best medical doctor in the world. You look for a dentist, the one who has studied that field. The same applies for everything. You want to make a building, you look for a civilian engineer. You want to make a huge thing, 100-story, or an even bigger one, you look for the best in the world, because if they don't have a huge amount of knowledge, it will collapse. Okay? So it's a basic principle. Society everywhere, respected everywhere, even in sub-Saharan Africa, in the dirt poorest one like Republic of Congo or Sierra Leone or Liberia, they respect that principle. Well, the only place where they do not respect it is in politics. There, every individual can predict, no matter how dumb, no matter how moronic. We just saw in the U.S. George W. Bush, it was unbelievable. The guy could barely spell his own name. He got there. Why? Because his father had been also president. And that opened doors. Why should that be a credential for being president? Because he looked almost identical to his father, who was the president. Why should that be a credential for being president? He got there also for irrational reasons. And this is the problem with democracy. Hitler got there for irrational reasons. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela got there for irrational reasons. And he's caused a big mess over there, all over Latin America. Not as big as the one Hitler caused, but a big one. Why should all these ignorant from the left, the right, or the center be getting systemically to power? Not only are they causing slow rates of economic growth, but they are even causing bigger problems. Chavez almost caused a war with Colombia. He was constantly threatening a war with Colombia because Colombia was trying to fight the guerrillas he's financing, who have become the biggest drug dealers in Latin America. George Bush went to Iraq, a war that was not rationally justified. Only Afghanistan was justified. Why? There is no rational explanation for this. And this is the situation. These people must not get to power. Look at the case. George Bush was 8 years in power, and he had a rate of economic growth over those 8 years. Average annual rate of economic growth that was a little bit over 2%. Bill Clinton, who was a much smarter person, everybody, you just have to hear him 2 minutes talk, each of them, and you immediately sense, independent if you're a person of the right, the center, you sense that Bill Clinton is a lot smarter. Bill Clinton, during his 8 years of presidency, attained a rate of economic growth of almost 4% annually. There is a correlation. So, why can't we restructure the democratic system so that it performs better? so that it guarantees faster rates of economic growth, which will decrease racism, anti-Semitism, crime. Here in Honduras, we have look, in most of Western Europe, Spain, for example, which is a country that ruled Latin America for like 300 years. Spain in 2010 had a rate of homicide, a per capita homicide, for every 100,000 people. How many people were killed? How many people were murdered? Just 2 persons. Here in the U.S., it's 10. That's the highest among developed countries. In most Germany, Scandinavian countries, most of these countries is just 1. Okay, in Japan it's 0. In Hong Kong it's 0. In Singapore it's 0. In Honduras it's 77 murders for every 100,000 people. It's crazy. It's crazy. People drop dead all day. Every day, dozens of young people being murdered because they're too poor, they're too unemployed, they run into drug dealing, and this is the most murderers of all criminal activities. So, we gotta get rid of this thing. The only thing is accelerating the rate of economic growth, and while doing that, we can also be fighting global warming, climate change, these major threats to society, to humanity. Simultaneously, we can keep low rates of inflation. It is possible. History shows it is possible. And the biggest bet that a nation can make, there is no guarantee, but you got like 80% chance of achieving all that. The big picture, the big kahuna, to have your cake and eat it. If you put the smartest persons of each country, there are impressive people in every nation in the world, whether in the U.S., whether in Germany, whether in Nigeria, whether in Bangladesh, whether in Russia, Japan, Australia, Brazil, India, Mexico, or Honduras. You got impressive people in everywhere. Why can't you how can we create a system? Well, simple. We expand the possibilities for voting, which is one of the basic tenets of society, of democracy. We expand it. In Germany, in the state of Bremen, in 2011, there were elections. And there was a big commotion. The biggest thing was that the Green Party, for the first time, won the most votes. But that was not as important as the following. The following is that this state decided to allow, since the beginning of democracy, it had been said, people 18 or over can vote. And the thing is that in Bremen, German states or German Länder have a lot of autonomy over how they decide the things, more than, for example, American states. And they decided to lower the age. 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. I would say that from 15 years of age, people can vote. Why? Because studies show that, for example, the Americans or the Germans or the Japanese of the year 1900, the geniuses of those times, the scientists of those times. For example, Thomas Edison lived in those times. Carl Benz, the inventor of the automobile in Germany, was alive in those times. These super geniuses, they are less intelligent than the average American or the average German or the average Japanese today. Why? Because today, a simple student who just finished high school in those countries knows things of physics, of engineering, of chemistry, that back then they didn't know. So, if back then, in the year, for example, 1900, it was allowed, at least in 1918, it was allowed. In Germany, the democratic system was fully allowed, and everybody 18 years or over was allowed to vote. In the U.S., in the year 1900, now women and minorities were not allowed to vote, but at least all male whites were allowed to vote, and the age was 18. So, if they were allowed to vote, and even the geniuses of back then are less smart, are less lucid and conscientious than the average people of today, why not allow a 15-year-old, which has at least as much as intelligence as an 18-year-old back then, for about 100 years, why not also allow them to vote? It makes all the rational, mathematical sense in the world. But so let's expand on matters of voting. But when it comes to who can be chosen as president, prime minister, also ministers, also deputies of Congress, why don't we create rules that only allow the smartest people in the world? For example, people that have at least a doctorate degree, a PhD, or an equivalent amount of years. They don't have to necessarily have that degree. They could have, for example, 3 or 4 master's degrees, or they got the 4 undergraduate degrees, and altogether they make the equivalent of as many years as a doctorate degree or a PhD, which is about 9 years of university education. I would put it at the postdoctoral level and demand 11 years. Even in nations like Nigeria, like Sierra Leone, like Liberia, you find people with these qualifications. Not a lot. So what? So what? For example, in the U.S., for the last 200 years, they've been basically people voting for just 2 persons. One, a conservative or a liberal. So if they're only, in Sierra Leone, there's only 2 persons with a postdoctoral level with 11 years of university education. Why not only those allowed to go to vote? If it's just 2 women, let them go. If it's just two guys, let them go. Just those 2. Why not? It makes sense. In that way, we guarantee an improvement in unemployment, a lower in unemployment, a decrease of it, an elimination like Singapore. It's been living like for the last 30 years with 0 unemployment. An improvement in the fight against global warming, an overall higher levels of wealth for all, less wars, less crime, less marital violence. Everything is linked to the economy. Less racism, less anti-Semitism. We can achieve the whole thing, but we gotta put our faith in science. The only thing that has improved living conditions over the last 5,000 years. Okay. Are exporting the jobs to China or India or wherever. It's basically that the policies, the economic policies in Western Europe and the U.S. have been bad in the last 30, 40 years, and therefore the rate of economic growth has been much slower. As a result, that the rate has been systemically going down. Nations like those of Western Europe and the U.S. need a bare minimum of 3% so that unemployment will not increase. If they have at a certain moment, like right now, they have a high level of unemployment and they want to reduce it, then they gotta attain a faster rate of growth. And as you can see, the vast majority of countries in Western Europe, and that includes the countries that are having big problems right now, like, for example, Greece, Spain, Portugal. These countries in the 1950s and the 1960s had a growth of 7-8% annually. That means over a 20-year period, they grew by about 7% per year. And right now, they're barely growing by 1% annually. So there's a big difference, and the question is why? Why has that changed so radically? Well, it's a matter of bad policies, because somebody can argue that perhaps us Latin Americans do not have the cultural merits or whatever to attain fast economic growth. But the fact is that we're comparing here Western Europe against Western Europe, or the U.S. against the U.S., and in past decades they attained much faster rates of growth. So the issue is how can Western Europe and North America get those rates of growth back to the rate? Hi, my name is Dr. Carlos Sabillon, and I've been doing research on economic growth for the last 20 years after I finished my doctorate degree at the University of Geneva, Switzerland. And right now the world is going through a big problem. Western Europe in general is having a big problem with its public debt. It can't pay it, and the United States has a similar problem. It has a huge deficit, a huge budget deficit, a huge public sector debt it can't pay. And everybody's very concerned about what's going to happen. Is the world going to fall into a second recession, into a second world depression as it did in 2008, 2009? And that is the thing. I've developed a new doctrine about how to solve economic problems anywhere in the world, not just for Europe and the U.S., but also for Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, which is such a big turmoil, and obviously the region where I come from, which is Latin America. We have been working very hard without pay the last 20 years in order to do this research, because the economic science has never figured out what causes economic growth. As a result of it, like 80% of the world population lives in poverty, and the other 20% that does not live in poverty has to endure regularly high levels of unemployment and underemployment because the rate of economic growth is too slow. And that is the basic problem with Europe and the U.S. Present problems, that they can't pay their debt. Their rate of economic growth in the last, not just years, not just since 2008 to the present, but also since like the 1970s, has been too slow. And I want to show you some statistics so that you can better grasp the idea. And as you can see, this is Western Europe. This is just the countries that were not under central planning, under communist rule during the Soviet Union period. And as you can see, the rate of economic growth has been decelerating significantly, and has been going down and down and down. And this situation has presented not just the problem of a big increase in unemployment and underemployment, but also a lack of flow of money into government coffers. That means the government is receiving a lot less money, because the slower the rate of economic growth, the more frequent will companies go bankrupt, or they will have losses which will drive them not to bankruptcy, but they will have to cut their payroll. They will have to fire a certain amount of workers. Sometimes it's small companies, medium or large one. It doesn't matter. As a whole, it affects them equally. So it's not a lack of morals that European or American businessmen are entertained in the 1950s and the 1960s. That's not just a cultural thing. Somebody says it's Western culture. No, Japan has suffered the same situation. I want to show you some statistics about Japan and see. As you can see, the rates of Japan, which has a completely different culture, that of Western nations like those in Europe, and particularly Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, they have been also going down, steadily down, to the point of they're barely growing. In the last decade, they barely had a growth. In the first decade of the 21st century, they barely had a growth of 1%. So this is comparable to that of Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe, which also grew by 1% in the first decade of the 21st century. So that is extremely bad when we think that Japan in the 1960s was growing at 11% annually, and Germany in the 1950s grew at 8% annually. Big gap. Somebody says because of the war. That's not the case. Sweden and Switzerland did not suffer any destruction of the war. There was nothing to reconstruct. That has been the traditional argument. And they grew by 6% annually in the 1950s and the 1960s. So there is no excuse for growing. It is something else. And what we know for sure is that the economic science is very different from other science. The science has never figured out what causes economic growth. It is not like medicine, where they have still not figured out, for example, a vaccine against cancer or a final cure against all forms of cancer. But they have made impressive achievement, and that's why we have nowadays, at least in most developed nations, a life expectancy of 80 years on average. That's what pretty much everybody gets to live in a nation like Germany or even Spain. And while 1,000 years ago, life expectancy was just of 17 years in those same nations. So there's been a big difference, and in part because sciences like the medical science have made big improvements. In economics, there has been practically no improvement on the fundamental matter, which is economic growth. So I've been working very intensively, and I've abstained from earnings over the last 20 years since I finished my PhD in Europe. And in Switzerland, and I did also a postdoctorate in Switzerland and a postdoctorate in Germany at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. And I've found a correlation which is very important with respect to growth. And I look at the economic history of all nations of the world, or the most important ones. From all cultures, Japan, Russia, Germany, Britain, the U.S., Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Iran, India. I looked at pretty much all cultures, and I found a consistent correlation which explained like 80% of the rate of economic growth. That is, when smarter people, more educated people would attain power, would become kings or would become presidents or prime ministers or heads of state. Doesn't matter. The fundamental person